Greetings. In my previous video, I mentioned the exchange Ruy Lopez, in connection with which I sometimes like to show my students the following game, played in 1908, between then world champion Dr. Emanuel Lasker and his challenger Dr. Siegbert Tarrasch as the first game of their world championship match. As usual, when I record a chess video, I'm using chess.com's analysis board with the chess engine Stockfish 12. And the game began as a Ruy Lopez. Lasker had white, Tarrasch had black, and black played Morphy's move a6. And usually when you play a Spanish game with a6, a Ruy Lopez, Spanish game, same thing, you'll see this move. The bishop will retreat. That's what you'll usually see. But occasionally someone will play the exchange variation by taking the knight. And that's what Dr. Lasker played here. And now I believe I've mentioned that you should not play the exchange variation with the idea of taking this pawn and celebrating. Yes, yes, I want a pawn. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Black will move the queen here, attacking the knight and the pawn. You can save the knight, but when you do, the pawn will die. So black will get the pawn right back. So white will not have won a pawn. So if you're going to play the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez, don't play it thinking that, yes, you're going to win a pawn. Oh, no, no. Black will get it right back. But you can go ahead and play d4. And then in this game, they traded queens. And at this point, you notice two things, which I believe I've mentioned before. First, although each side has a pawn majority, black has a 4-on-3 pawn majority on the queen side, and white has a 4-on-3 pawn majority on the king side. Still, one of them is better than the other. White's is a healthy pawn majority. There are no doubled pawns, and although these three pawns line up with those three pawns, this pawn doesn't line up with another pawn, doesn't line up with a black pawn. And although it's not a passed pawn now, it's a potential passed pawn. Whereas on the queen side, those doubled pawns make this a crippled pawn majority. This 4-on-3 is a crippled pawn majority. All the pawns line up. What's the important thing about that? Well, if you took off all of the pieces, left just the pawns, then white, with his healthy pawn majority, would be able to force the creation of a passed pawn over on the king side. But black, with his crippled pawn majority, would not be able to force the creation of a passed pawn over on the queen side. Well, that's an endgame advantage for white. So that's the first thing to notice about the position. The second thing to notice is that although each player has three minor pieces, okay, minor pieces being bishops and knights, although each player has three minor pieces, black has two bishops, white does not. So black has the advantage of the two bishops. And on a semi-open board like this one, where the bishops have some scope to play, that at least somewhat compensates black for the inferior pawn structure. So that's the second thing to notice. Okay, so black played c5, attacking white's knight. White retreated the knight to e2. Black developed his light squared bishop to d7. And white then played b3, preparing to fianchetto his dark squared bishop. Black moved his bishop to the long diagonal and attacked white's e-pawn, and white defended it with f3. So now it defends it. defensive. And black played his dark squared bishop out to e7. White fianchettoed the dark squared bishop, his own dark squared bishop, attacking the g7 pawn, and if black doesn't do anything about it, threatening to take the rook. Now black should just block the diagonal, probably by bringing the knight out. Instead, he blocks it by putting the bishop on f6. And that's not good. That's inferior, because it allows white to trade bishops. And now, remember, what was black's advantage that helped counter white's advantage in the pawn structure? It was having the two bishops. Well, now he doesn't have the two bishops anymore. If you don't have the two bishops, but your opponent does, so if your opponent has the advantage of the two bishops, it's often a good idea to trade off one of his bishops for a knight or for your bishop, so that he doesn't keep the two bishops on into the endgame. If you get rid of one of those bishops, trade off one of them, you often get a more manageable endgame if you manage to trade off one of those bishops. So that's what Dr. Lasker, playing white, has done. He's traded off one of Dr. Tarrasch's bishops. White has traded off one of black's two bishops. White still has his advantage in the pawn structure, but black no longer has the advantage of the two bishops. Okay, more moves. Knight to d2, black castled, white castled, both castled queenside. Rook to d7, knight to f4, rook to e8, knight to c4. They're maneuvering, positioning their pieces. E6, a4, a5. Okay. And now they trade rooks. White takes the d file with his rook. Black moves to e5. And here, it's important that white is the one who trades the knights. If white does something like h3, then black will trade knights. And now not only does white have weak pawns, but black will just zap that rook pawn. So white ends up with weak pawns and black has a passed pawn. That would not be good for white. Even if white retreats his knight, it's not good for white, because black will push c4. Now, if white takes the pawn, then black takes the a pawn, and now black has a passed pawn. White has weak pawns. Suddenly, black's queenside pawns look at least as good as white's kingside pawns. That would not be good for white. If white doesn't capture with the pawn, well, he could capture with the knight. But then knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, and again, white has weak pawns. Black not only has a pawn majority, but he has a passed pawn. That would not be good either. So white couldn't take with either the pawn or the knight. All right, well, suppose instead he played, let's say, h3, just to make it black's move. Well, then black would trade pawns. And now, this is a healthy 3-on-2 pawn majority. This pawn no longer lines up with a white pawn. Black doesn't have doubled pawns anymore. This is a healthy pawn majority. Well, if white has a healthy pawn majority on the king side, and black has a healthy pawn majority on the queen side, that nullifies white's pawn structure advantage. White doesn't want that. So, when black moves his knight to e5, white has to be the one to trade knights. And he does. And now this next white move is very important. White played c4. That's very important. Again, say white makes some inconsequential move. Then black will play c4. And once again, if white takes, then black takes, and white gets weak pawns. And not only does he get weak pawns, he's lost his a pawn, so black has a passed a pawn. That would be bad. If white doesn't take that pawn, if instead he plays, say, h4, then black will trade pawns. And once again, black now has gotten a healthy 3-on-2 pawn majority on the queen side instead of a crippled pawn majority. And again, that nullifies what used to be white's advantage, which was a healthy pawn majority on the queen side. Oh, I'm sorry, on the king side. So that would be bad for white. So white shouldn't allow this move. And he doesn't. He plays c4. Prevents the move. So he prevents this pawn push. Good. Okay. And now some more maneuvering. White attacks this g7 pawn. Black defends it by playing rook to g8. Now, in fact, you'll notice Stockfish prefers rook to e6. And you might wonder, how can that possibly be good? Doesn't it just give up the pawn? Well, yes, it does. But black then forks the knight and the pawn. And after the knight moves, probably to f5, rook takes. And now black has gotten his pawn back. He's made his rook active. It's on the 7th rank now, attacking this pawn. He'll be able to move it here and attack the f pawn. This bishop is stronger now. This is not good. This is not good for white. White might defend the h pawn by moving his rook forward, and then black checks. And now Stockfish just gives this line, at least for a couple of moves. But black's willing to do that forever, because that's perpetual check. That's a draw. I mean, that's just a draw by repetition. Draw by repetition. So white doesn't want to do that over and over. So he'll move his king up. Okay. Then black will attack the f pawn. White can hardly defend it this way, because then check. And since he's attacking this pawn, well, okay, what do? You need the rook to defend this pawn, but you need it to come back in order to defend that pawn. If you bring it back, he'll take that pawn. If you leave it where it is, black will take that pawn. Well, really? Really? So this would not be good for white. So once black moves the rook over here, what can he do? Well, maybe knight to h4. I will point out that this check, which forks the king and the bishop, doesn't actually win anything, because the king can come here and protect the bishop. So it doesn't actually win anything. Okay. So if white plays knight to h4, defending this pawn, then black gets to play f5. If white takes with the knight, then black takes the f pawn. And if that happens, then these are both isolated pawns. Now, this is a passed pawn. The c pawn is a passed pawn. But still, they're both isolated pawns, and black is probably going to be able to stop the pawns. And in fact, Stockfish gives the evaluation as dead even. If, on the other hand, white takes with the pawn, well, then black takes this one. Those are both isolated pawns. Now Stockfish gives knight takes, rook takes, and rook to d5, so that white can hold on to this pawn. But then rook to h3. attacking this pawn. And if you come back, well then just right back attacking the f pawn again. Attacking the f pawn again. And if white goes forward, okay, fine, go back and attack the h pawn. And if white comes back, come back over and attack. Well, you know, we can see that repeating over and over, right? Black would be happy with that. That's a draw. So we have to go back some to see the moral of the story. Okay. Okay, so the moral of the story is, if black comes up here, it's bad for white to take this pawn. So moving the rook up to e6 indirectly defends g7, because then it's bad for white to take the pawn. It's bad. That doesn't work out well. We just saw that. So that's why Stockfish recommends rook to e6. That's not what Dr. Tarrasch, playing black, played. He played rook to g8 and simply directly defended the pawn. And then rook to d3, f6, king to d2. Bishop back attacks the knight. So better do something about that. Lasker played knight to g3. Tarrasch played bishop to d7. Now white plays king to e3. And you can see the white king now is marching toward the center of the board. The white king is now becoming active. With queens off the board, and queens have been off the board for a long time, and with lots of other pieces off the board, there's not much chance of this white king's becoming checkmated. So he can start walking around the board and become active. And he can help white. So white's going to end up pushing his pawns. So he's going to push pawns to try to make a passed pawn. And his king is going to come up and help out. So his king's going to be a useful piece now. Black moves his rook over to e8. White attacks the g7 pawn again. And the g7 pawn can hardly advance to save itself because of knight takes pawn. So what does black do? Well, he could move the rook back to g8 and defend that way again. That's not what he does. Instead, he plays rook to e7 and defends laterally from the side. Okay. And now white starts pushing his pawns forward. And this g5 move, Stockfish informs us, is a mistake. For us to see why it's a mistake, I'm going to want to address that in another video. It gets too complicated. Similarly, there was a move back here, bishop to d7. Well, maybe it's coming later. Oh, maybe it's coming later. Okay, sorry. I guess it's coming later. All right. But bishop to d7 will also be labeled a mistake. And similarly, I won't go into why that's a mistake in this video. I'll look at it in another video because it's more technical detail I don't want to go into. Black plays f5, which is the best move. White comes back with his knight, and now black takes. And you can take with either the pawn or the knight. Obviously not with the king, since that would be check. But either way, Stockfish only evaluates this as even. And now bishop f5 pins the knight against the rook. So it's already pinned against the king. Now it's also pinned against the rook. And now it's also attacked twice. h5, rook to d7. And here, I don't understand the next move. I'm giving my best explanation of it. I'm going to say what I do understand and project a little bit. So you'll understand what I mean. The move that Lasker played here was rook to c3. Now, that's taking a rook that's challenging black's rook on the open file and putting it on a square where it runs into its own pawns. It has extremely little scope. It's doing pretty much nothing. It's taking an active rook and making it inactive. And it hands black the d file, and the black rook will be able to come down here, as it later does, and become very active. This just looks anti-positional to me. It's the kind of move you don't want to make. Now, I suspect that Dr. Lasker made this move because he could see what Stockfish sees. After the trade, Stockfish says this is dead even. White does still have this 3-on-2 pawn majority, but with the rooks off, Stockfish says this is dead even. I don't see that it's dead even. I don't, with many endgames, I can just look at them and I can see, oh yeah, okay, that's a draw. Or I can say, oh yeah, I see, that's a win. There are lots of endgames like that. Of course, there are lots that aren't. This is one where I can't just see that this is now dead even. I can't see that. I can see that these three pawns are on light squares, same color as the bishop. So if this bishop can ever get to this square, or maybe come down to this square, that pawn's in trouble. And once that pawn's gone, those pawns are in trouble. And that makes this harder for white to play than it otherwise would be. I can see that much. But I can't just see that, oh, this is a draw. I can't. Stockfish can. What I am guessing is that Dr. Lasker, who was playing white and who was, after all, world champion, saw, or at least had a pretty good idea, that after the rook trade, the position would be drawn. So at this point, Dr. Lasker played rook to c3, even though it made his rook inactive and gave black's rook the open file. Even though it did that, he was still willing to play it because he saw what the computer sees. Or at least he had a strong suspicion based on his experience that this would be a draw if the rooks were traded. So that's my guess as to why he made this move. Because otherwise, it is an anti-positional move. Putting it where it's inactive, taking it off of the open file where it was contesting the open file with black's rook, putting it where it's inactive, allowing black to have the file. Really? Looks bad. So I'm guessing that Dr. Lasker saw what Stockfish sees. The trading rooks would have resulted in a drawn ending. And black did indeed move his rook down to d1. And it becomes very active quickly. Now, this is, I told you bishop to d7 was a mistake, but I forgot that it came after after g5. Again, I do not see why this is a mistake. It takes playing through variations to see why it's a mistake. And I'm not going to do that here, but I hope to make another video in which I'll show why g5 was a mistake and why bishop d7 was a mistake with some variations to support the claims. But I'm not going to do it here. All right. So now white played rook to e3, rook to h1, attacking the pawn. And white moves his knight to defend the pawn. So black can't take it with his rook now. Black checks. The king moves up to e5. So now the white king is infiltrating black's side of the board, infiltrating black's territory. He's going to push the f pawn. And with the 3-on-2, he's going to make a pass pawn. And his king's helping out. And it's a little slow, it's a little laborious, but it's very methodical. But he has to make sure that he doesn't lose one of these pawns in the process. And right now, this h pawn is in some trouble. The black rook now attacks both the knight and the pawn. If the knight moves, then the h pawn will die. Is white forced to move his king back where it came from to defend the knight? No. No. f4 enables the rook to defend the knight. Occasionally, you find that you have that option in a position. Occasionally, you find that you can defend a piece by moving something out of the way so that another piece defends it. That's the case here. Now the rook defends the knight. The knight is sort of pinned, but of course, if it comes back to f1, it'll be defending the rook. Now, you wouldn't want to go to f5, because then he could play bishop takes knight, and his bishop would have just taken the knight, and his bishop would defend his rook. So, and if white stopped to take the bishop, then the rook would take the rook, and, well, he'd lose. So you wouldn't want to do that. But you could come back here. The black king moves, and white plays f5. White is slowly but surely advancing his pawns. The black rook moves to h4. Dr. Lasker pushes the f pawn. And white could have created a pass pawn right now by taking the pawn with his g pawn. Instead, he takes the pawn with his king. Now, Stockfish prefers taking with the g pawn. If you look at the evaluations, one way it's about +5. The other way it's about +4. Well, okay, if I make a move that's +4, I'm happy. That's winning. So I don't really care very much whether the computer says that that's an inaccuracy or not. I don't really care. It's winning. Now, could Lasker have taken with the g pawn? Yeah, sure. He could have done either one. Either one would have been winning. Now black's bishop comes back. This h pawn is now under attack twice and only defended once. But knight to f5. Now, obviously not bishop takes pawn because of knight takes rook. Wouldn't want that. How about rook takes pawn? Well, there are two ways of taking advantage of that. One way is knight to g7. When that bishop's under attack twice, and the rook's also under attack, and it's hard for black to save everything. He really can't save everything. But a better way, because it gets you into the simplest winning ending, is this. Check, and then check, working the rook and the king. So after the king moves, the rook will die, white will have an extra knight, black won't have anything but pawns. Simple winning ending. Simple winning ending. So black cannot take the h5 pawn. It's a poison pawn. Black plays rook to f4, which pins this knight so that it can't go to g7 or to d6 and attack the bishop again. can't move anywhere. This knight can't move anywhere. G6, pawn takes, and at this point, Stockfish gives black's best move as bishop takes pawn, giving up the bishop for the pawn. This pawn is unstoppable without giving up a piece. So Stockfish says, give it up now. Dr. Tarrasch played rook over behind the passed pawn, and that's in accordance with the maxim that rooks belong behind passed pawns. In front, well, that's the direction where the pawn's moving. So that's in front of the passed pawn. In back is where the pawn came from. Well, it came from here. So these squares are behind the passed pawn. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. You could say the same thing about the white rook. It belongs behind the passed pawn. The general rule, the general maxim we hear is rooks belong behind passed pawns, either to help them in the case of a white rook, to help support the pawn, or to guard against the pawns becoming a queen. So Dr. Tarrasch put the rook behind the passed pawn, and white sacrificed his rook for black's bishop. Zap. White takes the bishop. Well, now the bishop can't stop the pawn. The pawn moves to g7. There's a wall of squares. This king cannot cross that. He cannot walk there. He cannot get there. He cannot help stop that pawn. Only the rook is stopping the pawn. Only the rook is preventing the pawn from queening. And very soon, it won't be able to stop that either. The knight, after all, is going to be able to move to h6, controlling g8 and attacking the rook. And once the rook moves, then promote, and black will have to give up his rook for the queen, and white will still have an extra knight. So if black does something like this, then knight in here, and what can black do? Maybe he can give check 1,000 times, but that won't be enough. Once this pawn promotes, they'll have to give up the rook for it. Rook takes and knight takes. White will have an extra knight and win easily. Okay. After black played king to d7, though, Dr. Lasker didn't play knight to h6. He played knight to h4. Now, obviously, black can't take that knight because then white will promote to a queen. Queen versus rook with some pawns on the board. Well, white will win that. Okay. Now, if black doesn't take the knight, let's say he comes back here. Well, white's plan, his idea in moving here, remember we've said, if you see a knight on the edge of the board, it's probably headed somewhere else. Well, yeah, this knight is headed somewhere else. It's headed there. That was his idea back when the knight was there and he moved it there. His idea was to get it there. So if black moves, then the knight will block. And now the rook isn't stopping the pawn anymore. Next move, the pawn will promote. All black can do is start giving checks. Start checking. Okay. Start giving check. He can check all he wants to. We do have to make sure we protect the knight so that he can't play rook takes knight. Check. Now the rook can't come back here. No. If he moves over here, the pawn will promote. So check again. And now if he checks again, then he has nowhere to go. And the pawn's going to promote. So he doesn't check again. Instead, he'll go back to E1. And now it looks like he stopped the pawn. No, no. Knight to F8, check. Supported by the pawn. And black has his choice. He can take the knight, and then white makes a queen. Or he can move his king, pick a square, and white will make a queen. Well, okay, either way, white wins this. Okay, going back. Okay, so after knight to h4, Dr. Tarrasch saw all that, and he decided to give up his rook for the pawn. So now white just has an extra knight. White will win this. Well, black is going to try to get around to these pawns and munch pawns quickly. So he tries. Now the king can't take the knight because then white wins the race. And the pawn will march in. And meanwhile, this guy's defended, so black can never take it. So white will make a queen. So the black king can't take that knight. The black king can't take that knight. And indeed, Dr. Tarrasch did not take the knight. He played king to d3. And it looks like black's winning the race. Black's one tempo ahead. But white doesn't take this pawn. Sorry, this pawn. White doesn't take this pawn. After all, if he takes, then black will get one of these two. And white will still be winning. But there's no reason to do that. There's no reason to let him have one of those pawns when you have this move, which guards both pawns. Those three aren't going anywhere. And then this knight's going to hop in here, zap the pawn, bye-bye pawn. And then, well, let's just make a few moves. All black can do is move his king. Now this knight protects both of those pawns. So after a king move, pick off one of them, and then march in. Easy. Easy. Okay? And that king move right there, that king move, protecting both of the pawns, I have seen that occasionally come up. It can occasionally be important in an ending. It can occasionally be important in an ending. It came up in a game. Garry Kasparov had it, and I'm trying to remember whether it was against Karpov or not. I can't remember. But it does come up on occasion. And here, it just guards both pawns. There's no need for white to take this pawn. It's much more useful to defend both pawns. Those three are not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere. And then he can just pick them off with the knight. If he wants to, he doesn't even have to use the king. He can pick one off and then go back and then pick another off and then get out of the way and let the pawn march in. Yeah, okay, he can do that. But since once the knight gets here, it'll be defending both of those pawns, you might as well just take one of these pawns with the king and then march it in. March in your own pawn. So, just a quick replay of the game. It's a Spanish game, or Ruy Lopez, same thing. Spanish game, Ruy Lopez, same thing. And then Morphy's move a6 puts the question to the bishop: retreat or take the knight? And in this game, somewhat unusually, Lasker took the knight. And then, no, you don't take the pawn because of the queen move, and black will just get the pawn right back. So you're not winning a pawn. But the game proceeded with a quick queen trade, and now white has a healthy pawn majority on the king side, black has a healthy pawn, a crippled pawn majority on the queen side, but black does have the two bishops. And now some moves are made, and black was attacking the e-pawn, so white defended it. And now white's attacking g7, so black blocks the attack, but he doesn't block it with the knight, which he probably should do. Maybe blocking with the pawn would be okay. I don't know. Stockfish recommends blocking with the knight, which makes sense. Instead, Dr. Tarrasch allowed the trade of bishops. Now, I have to say, this game was played in 1908. You look in an old chess book, you will find that knights and bishops are both considered to be worth 3 points. They're considered to be equal in value in old chess books. Just 3 points each. Nowadays, we consider the knight to be worth 3 points and the bishop to be worth 3 points and a smidgen more. And certainly, if you have both bishops, that's a good thing. You want to keep both bishops if you can. There's more value placed on bishops than used to be placed on bishops, especially if you have both bishops. But of course, since 1908, we've had 113 years of chess, or 112 years at least, counting only to 2020, 112 years of chess to learn more about the game, and we have learned more about the game. So now, probably, if Dr. Tarrasch were playing now, he probably would not have allowed this, but he did. He put the bishop on f6 and allowed the bishop trade. And Dr. Tarrasch took. So now that black advantage of the two bishops has evaporated. But white's advantage of the healthy pawn majority versus the crippled pawn majority remains in place. And we see the maneuvering, developing pieces, maneuvering, trade of rooks. Now white has to be the one to trade here, otherwise he's going to lose a pawn. He's not only going to get weak pawns, he's going to lose a pawn. So white trades knights. And now c4, very important move in order to prevent this pawn move that either gives white weak pawns and loses this pawn so that black has a passed pawn, or allows black to capture and convert a crippled pawn majority into a healthy pawn majority, thereby doing away with white's advantage of having a healthy pawn majority versus a crippled pawn majority. So white does not want to allow this pawn move. Instead, he plays c4. White attacks the g7 pawn, and we noticed, because we have stockfish, that rook to e6 would have been good here. It would have prevented this knight takes pawn move, because the rook moving there would have picked up the g pawn, and that active rook would have been too strong for white to handle, and black would have easily held the draw. So that would be better, but black played rook to g8. And now some more maneuvering. White starts moving his king toward the center to help out. White attacks the g pawn again. This time black defends laterally from the side. Okay. White starts advancing his pawns in order to make a passed pawn. This is a mistake, but I'm not going to go through the variations to see why in this video. I hope to make another video in which I do go through some variations to show why. But this is part of why. This is the best. This is the follow-up. And then trade on e4. Dr. Lasker took with the knight. He could have taken with the pawn. Either way, Stockfish has it as an even game. And now, the only way I can make sense of this move, very anti-positional, making this rook inactive, taking it off of the open file so that it no longer challenges the black rook, allows the black rook to become very active, becomes a very inactive rook itself. It's just ramming into its own pawns. That's really an anti-positional move. And the only reason I can imagine for Dr. Lasker's playing it, as well as for Stockfish's recommending it, is that after the rook trade, it is apparently a drawn ending. Stockfish says it's drawn, and I guess Dr. Lasker knew enough to at least suspect that it would be a drawn ending. He might have known, he might have only suspected, I don't know. But he was world champion, he had played a lot of endings, he had a lot of experience with the game, and I suppose that he probably recognized that it was going to be a drawn ending. So rather than go into the drawn ending, he inactivated his own rook. It's an anti-positional move, but he did it. And there goes black, playing with his rook. And now this is another mistake, according to Stockfish, that I'm not showing any detail about. I do hope to make another video in which I show both variations involving g5, why it was mistaken, and involving bishop to d7, why that was mistaken. You do have to look at variations, otherwise, well, I can't see any kind of general rule or anything about the position that would make you suspect that it was a mistake. Maybe a grandmaster could. I can't. I don't see it. Anyway, rook over, attacking the h pawn. White has just enough time and just enough defensive possibilities here to hold the h pawn. And the king is infiltrating to help advance, to help support the advance of the passed pawn of the pawn phalanx, which will make a passed pawn. And White is able to defend with the rook by advancing the f4, the f3 pawn to f4. And now there's f5, and White is advancing those pawns. And now White could make a passed pawn already by taking with the g pawn. Instead, Dr. Lasker chose to take with the king. Either way is a winning move. Either way wins. Black now is threatening the h5 pawn, but White attacks the rook, and the rook can't take because of the cute tactic, which wins the rook, and White will have an extra knight, and White will easily win. Even if you didn't see rook takes knight, even if you just saw this, that would win too. But rook takes bishop gets you to the simpler ending faster. So, yeah, if you can get to a simple winning ending fast, okay, that's probably good. So black can't take that pawn. Instead, he pins the knight so that it can't move to g7, can't move to d6, can't attack that bishop. I think g7 is the square you'd be aiming for because that would also defend h5. But now it can't go there. Black is threatening to take the pawn. But no, g6. Trade. And that pawn is unstoppable. So Stockfish says, take the pawn now with the bishop, give up the bishop for it. That would lose, but still, that's apparently the best move. Dr. Tarrasch put his rook behind the passed pawn. Remember, the direction it's heading tells you where is in front of the passed pawn. The direction it came from tells you where the squares are behind the passed pawn. And the general rule is rooks belong behind passed pawns. And now white gives up his rook for the bishop and advances the pawn and creates this little pawn wall, this little wall of squares that this black king can't cross. So the king isn't going to be able to help stop the pawn. And all that's required now is for white to stop this black rook from taking the pawn once it makes a queen. And Dr. Lasker chooses to do that by playing knight to h4, and then he's going to put the knight on g6. And there's going to be nothing black can do about it. Black can't take the knight, white will just promote. So black gives up the rook, and then black is going to try to win the race to the pawns and try to hold the draw by taking enough pawns, but white doesn't even let black take the second of those 3 pawns. This defends both pawns. Those are going nowhere, and the white knight will just hop in, munch a pawn. Then, because the knight will defend both pawns, the white king will take a pawn and then get out of the way, and the pawn will advance. And we can see all that, right? We can see all that. So we have the plan that'll win, and that's why Dr. Tarrasch resigned here. So that Dr. Lasker won game 1 of their world championship match. Lasker went on to win the match, 8 wins to 3, with 5 draws. Dr. Lasker then remained world champion until 1921, when he gave up the title to the great Cuban Jose Raul Capablanca. J.R. Capablanca was a tremendous chess player and a worthy champion to succeed Dr. Lasker. That's it for this game. As always, try to win. But more than that, try to play well.